Hi everyone. I'm going to take a look at the first game that's in the book My 60 Memorable Games by Bobby Fischer. And Bobby Fischer is a chess hero of mine. He's also a chess hero of my father's. Now my father taught me chess when I was 11 or 12 years old, and he showed me the games that Fischer played in his 1972 World Championship victory against Boris Spassky. And ever since I learned about that championship, Fischer has been a constant chess idol of mine. And thanks to my father who instilled the love of this game in me, I wanted to dedicate this video to him. Now, the game we're going to look at took place in 1957 at the New Jersey State Open. And a little spoiler alert, Fischer won. Okay, so Fischer won the New Jersey Open. He was about 14 years old. He was born in 1943. And it was I think it was a 7-round Swiss system tournament. And it marked the third major tournament in a row that young Fischer had won at the time. His opponent was James T. Sherwin, and Sherwin was about 10 years older than Fischer. He was an international master. He actually gained that title the year after this game took place. And Sherwin was a well-known chess player, well-known enough to have a Wikipedia page. And I learned that he was once the U.S. speed champion in chess. He was a New York state champion. He tied for third or fourth at the U.S. championships multiple times. So he was a very good player. He's still alive today. I don't know if he plays chess. He was born in 1933. On the other hand, Fischer was already a well-known player, even at the age of 14. And in contrast to Sherwin's multiple third and fourth place finishes at the U.S. championships, Fischer entered the U.S. championships 8 times in his life, and he won all 8 times. In particular, in 1963, in the 63-64 tournament, he scored a perfect score of 11 out of 11 at that U.S. championship. Fischer has so many great accomplishments in the chess world, I'm not going to bother to talk about them all, but I will mention that in 1970 and 1971, leading up to his World Championship match, he dominated his contemporaries at chess to such an extent that had never been seen before and has never been seen since. And for that reason alone, I believe Bobby Fischer is the world's greatest chess player, bar none. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the game. And this I learned about, again, from the book My 60 Memorable Games, with analysis by Fischer himself. And Fischer was white, and he opened with e4, as he often did. And his opponent played the Sicilian defense, knight f3, and Sherwin opted for e6 here. And now Fischer played in a closed fashion with d3 rather than an open Sicilian with d4. And Fischer said that this is how he often liked to play the Sicilian when he was younger, especially against e6. Perhaps if black had made some other second move, then Fischer would have played in an open fashion. So Fischer's plan here is to fianchetto the light squared bishop, since he just blocked it in. And when you do that, when you play g3 and bishop g2 and knight f3, then you can call this a King's Indian attack, as opposed to a King's Indian defense, which is what you call it when black adopts that setup on the king side. Okay, so after d3, Sherwin played knight c6, okay, developing the knight toward the center. And since this bishop is locked in, Fischer plays g3 to fianchetto it. Sherwin gets the other knight into the game. And then bishop g2 finishing the development of the bishop. Bishop b7. And now both players are ready to castle. Okay, and here Fischer decides to develop his queen's knight to the d2 square rather than the natural c3 square. And his point is he would like to eventually expand in the center by playing c3 and d4. And so he doesn't want to block his c pawn. And now Sherwin plays an interesting move, rook b8. And Fischer remarks in the book that when Sherwin played that move, he slid the rook over very slowly with his pinky finger. Okay, so I don't know the point of this move. Fischer doesn't really discuss it at all. And it's hard to see why Sherwin made that move, but perhaps he was worried about Fischer playing e5 at some point and opening this long diagonal where the bishop would be pointed at the rook. So he's just getting the rook out of danger. He plans to push his b pawn forward and fianchetto the bishop, and the rook will be protecting it. So it makes some sense. Okay, so after rook b1, Fischer centralizes his rook and protects his e-pawn. And now Sherwin pushes his d-pawn modestly forward, just one square. I think he would have done better to push it forward 2 squares and engage Fischer's center immediately. But he plays in this timid fashion, d6. Okay, so Fischer begins his expansion plan in the center with c3 followed by d4. And now Sherwin makes another modest pawn move. He pushes his pawn to b6. And again, I think it's better to push that pawn 2 squares to b5 and then just start expanding on the queen side here. Just start marching your pawns forward. Since white is playing a King's Indian attack, he's going to try to attack on the king side. Black needs to get his counterplay on the queen side. But he pushes it forward 1 square with the intent of fianchettoing. Okay, and then Fischer completes his plan of building his ideal pawn center, getting 2 pawns in the center of the board. And now Sherwin makes a move that Fischer says gets him into a lot of trouble. He plays queen to c7. And the reason that's going to get him into trouble is kind of subtle, and you have to see pretty far in advance to understand why that's not such a good move. But it's based on the fact that Black has just lined up his rook and his queen on this dark square diagonal. And what Fischer is going to do is his plan will be to develop his dark square bishop to the f4 square, try to open that diagonal, and skewer the rook behind the queen. And he, in fact, gets that accomplished. Okay. All right, so what should Black have done instead of queen c7? Well, I think he should have taken the pawn on d4. This is the line Fischer gives in his book, and then push to d5 and block up the center, induce white to lock it up like this. And I think that's a much better way to play. Okay, but he plays queen to c7. And so now Fischer's plan is to open the dark square diagonal, and he does it by playing e5, forking the knight and the pawn. If the knight weren't under attack, Black would be able to push this pawn past white's and keep that diagonal blocked. But he can't. Okay, so what Sherwin decides to do is play this knight to the center of the board on d5, which is a good try because it has its eye on this f4 square, which is where Fischer would like to develop that dark squared bishop to point at the queen and the rook. So that move makes some sense, although it doesn't work out so well. Fischer remarks that knight to d7 is even worse, and he says black probably should have tried to exchange pawns here and then drop the knight back, and now black has 3 attackers on that pawn. So Fischer had planned to defend with his queen. So Fischer has 3 defenders. Black would probably develop their final minor piece, and Fischer would have played h4 here. And he says white has a bind on the position. If you look at black's pieces, they have absolutely no scope. His dark squared bishop can't go anywhere. It's blocked. This knight can't go anywhere either. It's completely blocked. This pawn on c3 has the other knight corralled nicely. So black is struggling to find moves, and Fischer's far advanced center pawn is giving him more space in that line. However, Fischer thinks black might have been able to hold the game if he had chosen that way of playing. Okay, but instead of exchanging pawns, he plays knight to d5. Okay, so here, while Fischer has a chance, he takes the pawn on d6 in order to open up the dark square diagonal here, free that diagonal of all pawns. Okay, and then he plays knight to e4, threatening the bishop. So Fischer's threat here in the position is to take that bishop, draw the queen forward to the d6 square, then play c4 to dislodge the knight, which is protecting the f4 square, and then he can play bishop to f4, skewering the rook behind the queen. Okay, so just to see all of that in action, I'll show you what would happen if black did not play the move that he did. Black chose to play c4, but if instead he had done something like developed his light squared bishop, then this is the plan I was talking about. So Fischer would have removed the bishop, pushed the pawn to c4 to dislodge the knight, and then played bishop to f4 here with an advantage. Okay, so that is exactly why Sherwin decided to push his pawn to c4, to stop white from dislodging that knight, so the knight can remain as a defender of that f4 square. Okay, so Fischer takes off the dark squared bishop there, like that, and he claims an advantage in this position. And the reason white has an advantage is, well, 2 reasons really. He just gained the bishop pair. So it's well known amongst strong players that having a pair of bishops when your opponent doesn't have a pair of bishops is a good advantage, and it's called having the bishop pair. But also, since black pushed his pawn forward to c4, black is no longer pressuring white's center. So black has no play in the center, he has no play in the queen side, and so this gives white free reign on the king side. It's got a lot of open space over here. He can start attacking the black king, and black will have no counterplay. In fact, white starts right away by playing knight to g5, targeting the weak h7 square. So his plan is to put his queen on c2 and mate on h7. So black needs to have a plan to block that mate threat that's coming. And it turns out that Sherwin picked the wrong plan. He played his c knight to e7 with the idea of letting that knight rest on g6, blocking any action along that diagonal. Turns out not to work, as we will see, and instead Fischer says black should have kicked that knight away right away. Probably would have gained a tempo on the queen would fall back, and the game would continue, again with advantage to white because of the bishop pair and the fact that he has more space and he can continue to attack on the king side. Okay, but he didn't kick the knight away, so Sherwin plays that move instead. And after that move, Fischer goes ahead and threatens the checkmate on h7, and then Sherwin follows it up by blocking with the knight. There really is, at this point, no good way to stop the checkmate. Let's look at a couple of other options. For example, if black had played f5 to block the diagonal, then Fischer would have had queen to e2, and he's forking these two pawns. Both of those pawns are under threat of being captured, and black cannot save them both. White would not only gain a pawn, but he would gain a lot of piece play, and he would be up with a big advantage in the position. Okay, so f5 doesn't work. g6 also is not such a good move because it weakens all the dark squares around the black king. Fischer would have removed his knight here, attacking the queen. It would fall back. He would develop his bishop to h6 with a tempo on the rook. It would slide over, and Fischer would have slid his queen over to d2, a dark square, and start targeting all of these dark squares around the black king. And he would have a strong attack. So nothing at this point really works well against this mate threat. Perhaps this knight to g6, Sherwin's idea was actually the best try. Okay, so Fischer's move here is very good and instructive. He plays h4. So he's threatening to push it to h5 and dislodge this knight and then mate on h7. So black needs to do something about it, and Sherwin decides to move knight to f6 to protect that square so the pawn cannot be pushed. There wasn't any better move, but it turns out not to work again. This move knight to f6 has a flaw. It is nice that it's not only stopping the pawn from pushing, but it's also defending this mating square should this knight have to move away, which is nice. But here Fischer makes a remarkable move, the move of the game. Brilliant move here. And I want to give you guys a chance to see if you can find it. And let me give you a hint. Fischer would like to drive this knight away, so it's no longer defending the h5 square, so that he can push the pawn to h5 and then drive that knight away. He wants to drive both knights away. How can he drive that knight away and follow through with h5? Okay, if you want to give it a try, pause the video. All right, so the brilliant move Fischer came up with here is knight takes h7. And Fischer makes some kind of remark in the book like tactics naturally flow from a superior position. So how does he get away with this move? By the way, the point of this move is to win a pawn and attack the rook. And if the rook moves away, Fischer's going to remove that knight. And that knight was defending h5, and then he's going to push h5, and everything's going to fall apart. So black has nothing better than to take that knight. Now he has two ways he can take it. He takes the correct way with his knight. If he had taken with the king, the problem with that is that immediately places the g6 knight in a pin and allows white to win a rook with bishop to f4. That's the desired move. Don't forget, he's trying to skewer that rook, and that knight is no longer defending since it's pinned. The queen would have to move away somewhere, white would get the rook, and white would be up a rook and a pawn for the knight he invested on h7, and it would be a winning position. So the king cannot take. So this knight has to take, and Fischer accomplished exactly what he wanted to do. Divert that knight away so it's no longer defending h5. So now Fischer follows up by pushing his pawn to h5. So it looks lost here because if that knight moves away, then Fischer has the move bishop to f4, winning material. But it turns out the knight has to move away somewhere, and Sherwin puts up the best fight he can. He makes the best move here, which is a tricky move. Knight to h4, giving the piece back if white wants to take it. And it sets a subtle trap here. Probably not subtle for the likes of Fischer, but subtle for mere mortals like ourselves. The point is, after bishop to f4, the queen can fall back, and Fischer cannot take the rook. Okay, Fischer doesn't take the rook in this position. In fact, he takes the knight. Why can't he take the rook? The reason he can't take the rook is because Sherwin would trade these minor pieces, drawing the king to this g2 square, and then call check with a discovered attack on the bishop. And once Fischer gets out of check, black would win the bishop back, and it's actually black who's winning now, having two minor pieces for white's rook and having the initiative in the position. Okay, so that's why Fischer doesn't take the rook, he takes the knight. Okay, well, after taking the knight, the rook is still under attack, so Sherwin has to do something about it. But notice the light-squared bishop raking across these squares. Well, Sherwin does the best he can. He pushes the rook to b7, where at least it's protected by his light-squared bishop. So if Fischer takes it, then Fischer wins an exchange. He'll be up in exchange. But he's going for more than that. He doesn't take the rook. Instead, he continues to relentlessly attack the black king by pushing his pawn. Okay, and now Sherwin makes a mistake. He's losing in the position. According to the engine, black is down about 2 points in the position, or 2.5 points in the position. But he could have put up more of a fight if he hadn't played queen takes h4. Okay, the problem with that move is it just allows white to open up the black king. And what black should have done was try to keep the king's position closed up like this. Fischer would have tried to open it with h5, but then the pawn can push again, attacking the bishop, which can go to e5, and now Fischer remains up a pawn, has the bishop pair, and is still pressing against the black king. White is still has a big advantage in the position. Not to mention he's still attacking the rook. And by the way, black cannot continue to block out that bishop. That would blunder because white would remove the rook, which was defending the 7th rank, and if black takes back, then there's a mate in 2. The queen infiltrates here and mates on the g7 square. So that's not possible. So you'd have to let this bishop remain on e5 in a strong position pointed in this direction. Okay, but Sherwin did not keep his king position locked up after h6. He plays queen takes h4. Fischer removes this pawn and threatens the rook here. And black should have just moved the rook out of the way and let his king hide behind the shelter of the enemy pawn. Instead, he plays the suicidal-looking move, in Fischer's words, king takes g7. Okay, now his king is wide open, and Fischer finishes the game in a brilliant fashion, very accurate attack on the black king. He plays rook to e4, right in line with the queen, defending his bishop, and the threat is bishop to e5 check, winning the queen. So the queen steps aside here, and then Fischer drops his rook back to the e3 square. Now the threat is rook to h3, attacking the queen. And if the queen moves away somewhere far like here, then the knight on h7 is lost. Notice the white queen and rook would be pointing at it. So the threat is rook h3, and this queen would have to stay in contact with the knight by moving to g6, but that doesn't work because the rook would then move to g3, pinning the queen to the king, and the queen would be lost, and the game would be lost. So Sherwin tries his best. He pushes the pawn to f5, blocking out the white queen so it would not be attacking the knight. Fischer attacks the black queen anyway. It drops back to e8, and that knight is no longer in danger of being captured because of the f5 pawn. But Fischer continues to attack with bishop to e5 check, and this knight is in danger if the king runs away, and moving here or here turns out to be pretty bad. Black's best try here is to block the check with the knight on f6. Okay, but then queen comes to d2, nice move, threatening to come to h6 with check and infiltrate the position. So the king steps over, tries to run towards the queen side. Fischer plays queen here, attacking the knight for a second time. And black has to defend with the queen. Okay, the only other way to defend the knight would be to move the king over, but then this check is devastating with this rook over here on the b7 square, which has still been under attack by that bishop on g2 this whole time. So that doesn't turn out so well. So Sherwin plays queen here to defend. Okay. And now Fischer would like to get the rook to the 7th. The knight is defending. It's not defending in the line we just saw because it's pinned by the queen. Okay. But here in the game, it's defending the h7 square, so Fischer removes it. Okay, then queen takes the bishop, regaining the material. The rook comes here with check. King goes away. Fischer takes the queen. And now the game's over. Sherwin plays one more move. Rook takes rook. And Fischer's point is he cannot even take the queen back because there's bishop takes b7. And the rook defends the bishop and whites up a whole rook in the position. And it's an easy win. So black tries one last desperate move. He takes the rook off the board. But then Fischer plays bishop to c6, check. And here black resigned. So notice black has no moves with the king, so he might have blocked with the bishop. But then there's this nice move, queen takes pawn check. Since the bishop is pinned, it cannot take the queen. So the king can move over, or maybe something like this can happen, blocking. But then we win a whole bishop because the rook is pinned, and white is just dominating. So it would have been an easy win. All right, so great game, certainly memorable. And I look forward to making more videos of analyzing these games in this book. All right, thanks for watching.